He thought he could humiliate an old veteran in a cafe, but he didn't know Chuck Norris was his son. What happened next shocked everyone who saw it. Watch until the end and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Morning settled over the small Texas town in a hush of golden light, the kind that slanted across cracked sidewalks and lingered on rusted mailbox flags still lifted from yesterday's mail. The street was quiet, the air warm with the promise of another scorcher, cicadas already tuning their high, steady song from the oak trees that line the narrow streets. The diner on the corner, with its chipped green paint and squealing door hinges, waited in its place like it had for decades, the smell of coffee and bacon drifting out whenever the wind shifted. Inside a small, neat apartment 2 blocks away, Ray D. Norris pushed himself up from the edge of his bed, feeling the same steady ache in his knee as he did every morning, the old shrapnel buried deep enough to remind him it was still there. At 85, Ray moved with a slow, deliberate care, but he did not move as a defeated man. His shoulders remained square, his jaw set with the discipline of a man who had survived more than one war and the harder years that came after. The room around him was quiet, a small fan clicking in the corner, a thin curtain moving gently with the breeze from the cracked window. On his bedside table, a framed photograph showed a young Ray in uniform, standing beside 3 friends under the blunt sun of a Korean hillside, helmets pushed back on sweaty foreheads, their eyes bright with youth that never believed it could end. Beside it, an old steel canteen, dented and polished smooth from decades of hands gripping it during restless nights. Next to these, a cap with faded embroidery reading "Wowit Vet" rested, carefully positioned so the letters faced him each morning, a silent reminder of who he was before the world grew louder and faster around him. Ray stood, adjusting the belt of his worn jeans, slipping on a white shirt he had pressed the night before, smoothing it down with the hands that trembled just slightly when they hovered in the air but were steady when they touched cloth. He moved to the window, looking down the street as the morning unfolded, children rolling past on bicycles, a man walking his dog, a young woman pushing a stroller, each absorbed in the quiet urgency of starting their day. The coffee pot gurgled in the small kitchen, the scent pulling him from the window. Ray poured a cup, black and strong, the way he'd learned to drink it in Korea when hot coffee was the only warmth they had in the bitter cold. He took a slow sip, letting the heat settle in his chest as he moved to the small table where a notebook lay open, its pages covered with notes he wrote to himself, reminders to pay bills, a list of groceries, a quote he had heard on the radio that struck him enough to record, "We don't get to choose our time, only what we do with it." He read it again, nodding, the memory of voices in foxholes coming back with a vividness that made the kitchen around him feel smaller. Today, he would go to the diner, as he did every morning, to sit by the window, sip his coffee, and watch the town wake up. It was his ritual, a claim to a space that reminded him he was still part of this world, even if the world often seemed to have forgotten men like him. He finished the coffee, washed the cup, dried it with a towel, and placed it back on its hook, each movement part of a rhythm that kept the morning steady, even as the years pulled at him. Ray took his cap from the table, setting it on his head, adjusting it so the brim shaded his eyes just enough. He checked himself in the small mirror by the door, noting the lines in his face, the silver of his hair beneath the cap, the blue of his eyes still clear despite the weight they carried. He picked up his cane, a simple wooden staff that had been with him since the surgery years back, its handle worn smooth where his hand rested, and opened the door to the morning. The walk to the diner was slow, but not because he was unwilling. Each step was measured, his boot heels tapping on the concrete, a sound that was comforting in its consistency. He nodded to the mailman as he passed, a young man who always offered a polite "Mr. Norris," but never paused long enough for conversation. Ray didn't mind. He preferred the nods, the acknowledgement without pity, the recognition that he was here, that he had earned a place on these streets. The trees lining the road gave off the scent of hot leaves and dust, the sun rising higher, heating the metal of parked cars, the air shimmering slightly above the pavement. As he neared the diner, the familiar squeak of its sign swaying in the breeze reached him, and he felt a small comfort, the way a soldier might feel when he sees the first sign of camp after a long patrol. Inside the diner, the radio played softly, an old country song from the 60s, the voice scratchy but warm, filling the space between the clatter of dishes and the soft murmur of morning conversations. Rose, the owner, looked up as Ray entered, giving him a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes, her gray hair pulled back in a bun, an apron tied around her waist. Ray nodded to her, making his way to his usual seat by the window, the one that allowed him to see the street and the people as they passed. He lowered himself into the chair, placing his cane carefully beside him, taking off his cap and setting it on the table, brim facing the window. Rose brought him his coffee without asking, setting it down with a gentle "Here you go, Ray," before moving off to tend to other customers. He wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the heat sink into his palms, looking out the window at the town he had watched change over the years, the storefronts that had come and gone, the children who had grown up and moved away. Ray took slow sips, savoring the warmth, letting his mind drift to memories that came unbidden in the quiet. The mornings in Korea, the cold that settled into his bones, the laughter of young men who were trying to hold on to hope, the explosions in the distance that marked the reality of their situation, the friends he had lost, the moments that replayed in the darkness when he tried to sleep, the promises he had made to the men who didn't come home. He had learned to carry those memories without letting them crush him, but on mornings like this they pressed closer, the ghosts of the past settling in the empty chair across from him. Outside, the street grew busier. A mother walked by with her young son, the boy pointing at something across the road, his voice high and excited. A delivery truck pulled up to the store next door, the driver jumping down to unload boxes, calling out a greeting to a passerby. Life moved forward, indifferent but constant, and Ray watched it with the quiet acceptance of a man who had seen enough to know that each moment was worth witnessing. His eyes moved to the reflection in the window, seeing himself there, the cap on the table in front of him, the lines on his face softened by the glass, the ghost of the young man he had been layered over the man he had become. He wondered if people saw him when they looked, or if they only saw the old man with the cane and the veteran's cap, if they knew that behind the steady gaze was a lifetime of stories, victories, losses, and the simple will to keep moving forward. The door of the diner opened, the bell jingling as a young couple entered, laughing softly, sliding into a booth near the back. Ray watched them for a moment, the way the young man held the door for the woman, the way she smiled at him, the warmth between them so obvious that it made Ray's chest tighten with a memory of a girl he had once known, long before the wars, long before the world had hardened around them both. He turned back to his coffee, taking another sip, letting the warmth ground him. This was his morning, his claim on the world that often moved too fast, his reminder that he was still here, still part of it, even as it shifted and changed around him. The ghosts would stay, but so would he, for as long as he could. Outside, a police car cruised down the street, moving slowly, the young officer inside glancing out at the people on the sidewalk. Ray's eyes followed the car, a small frown touching his brow, but he said nothing, turning back to his coffee, his reflection in the window, and the steady hum of the diner that wrapped around him like a thin, comforting blanket. The world outside could wait. For now, he was here, in this moment, in this small diner on a Texas morning, a veteran with stories in his bones and a cup of coffee warm in his hands, the quiet before whatever would come next. The coffee had gone lukewarm in Ray's cup as the street outside the diner grew busier with the rhythm of the morning. Children in backpacks hurried by with their parents, shop doors opened, and the light shifted from soft gold to the sharper glare of the day's heat. Ray sipped slowly, his gaze drifting across the window, watching life pass while memories pressed softly at the edges of his mind. The hum of the diner comforted him, the clink of plates, the hiss of the coffee pot, the low country song murmuring from the radio in the corner, all reminders that the world continued on, even as it felt smaller around him some days. The door opened again, the small bell overhead giving its usual jingle, but something in the way the light changed made Ray glance up, his blue eyes narrowing slightly under the brim of his cap. A young police officer stepped in, tall and broad, his uniform crisp and his belt heavy with equipment that jangled faintly as he walked. His steps were loud on the linoleum floor, echoing in the morning, hush that seemed to deepen as the regulars noticed him. His face was set in a look that was almost a smirk, his eyes scanning the diner with the practiced air of someone accustomed to being noticed and enjoying the discomfort it brought others. Ray watched him quietly, his hands still wrapped around the cup, the warmth seeping into fingers that had long since grown used to the morning stiffness. He had seen men like this before, men who wore authority like a weapon, who measured their worth in the fear they saw in others' eyes. The officer's gaze landed on Ray's table, pausing on the veteran's cap lying beside the coffee cup, and something flickered across his face, something that looked like satisfaction mixed with boredom. The officer approached the counter first, speaking to Rose in a voice that was too loud, asking for coffee, making a show of dropping a bill onto the counter with exaggerated casualness. Rose, her hands trembling slightly, poured the coffee without meeting his eyes, her face careful and polite, the lines around her mouth tightening as she turned away quickly, busying herself with the dishes in the sink. The officer took his coffee and turned, his eyes scanning the room again before settling back on Ray. With deliberate steps, he approached Ray's table, standing just close enough to make the space feel smaller, to press the air between them into something uncomfortable. Ray looked up, his face calm, the lines deep around his mouth and eyes, his back straight as it could be, his hands steady as he set the cup down on the table. "Morning," the officer said, his tone edged with something sharp, his eyes flicking again to the cap, then to Ray's lined face, then back to the cap, as if it annoyed him with its quiet presence. Ray nodded, a small acknowledgement, and reached for his cup again, lifting it with slow care, taking a sip, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. He had learned a long time ago that fear only fed men like this, that silence was often stronger than words, and that dignity was a shield no one could take unless you let them. The officer tilted his head, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes, and took a sip of his coffee, looking around the diner before stepping closer, letting his shadow fall over the table. The small hum of conversation that had begun to rise in the diner fell away again, the other customers turning their eyes to their plates, their cups, the windows, anywhere but at the table where the young officer and the old veteran sat in a quiet, taut space that felt like a wire ready to snap. "Nice hat," the officer said, pointing his coffee cup at the cap on the table, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "You one of those parade veterans, huh? Walk around looking for a discount, getting in the way." Ray did not respond immediately, setting his cup down carefully, his fingers folding around the cap, lifting it and setting it gently back on the table, his eyes holding the officer's without blinking. The diner felt smaller, the air thicker, the sounds from the street outside dull and distant. "Served my time," Ray said finally, his voice low but clear, steady with a weight that did not require volume to carry it across the small space. The officer's smirk widened, his eyes brightening with a spark of cruel amusement as he leaned closer, setting his coffee on Ray's table without asking, the cup sloshing slightly, dark liquid spilling onto the surface and spreading slowly toward the edge. "Your time, huh? Bet you think that makes you special," he said, his hand reaching out, a finger poking the brim of Ray's cap, pushing it down onto the table, the gesture sharp and disrespectful. Ray's hand shot out, steady despite the slight tremor, lifting the cap again, brushing it off, setting it carefully back on the table. His eyes did not leave the officer's face, but something in them changed, a glint of iron beneath the blue, a cold reminder that this was not the first bully Ray had faced, nor would it be the worst. "Watch your manners, son," Ray said, his voice still calm, but the edge in it sharp enough to slice the air between them. The officer's smile fell away, replaced with a sneer as he leaned down, bringing his face closer to Ray's, the smell of cheap aftershave and coffee mixing in the space between them. "Or what, old man? You gonna take a swing at me? You gonna stand up and show me your medals?" His voice was louder now, drawing the attention of every person in the diner, the conversations silencing completely. The only sounds now the soft hiss of the coffee pot and the hum of the radio, the world outside the windows continuing on, oblivious. Ray did not flinch, did not blink, only straightened slightly, his back pulling tighter, his hands resting on the table, one over the other, the cap between them. His eyes were steady, cold, a glacier's patience within them as he watched the young man in front of him, seeing not a uniform, but a child playing a dangerous game he did not understand. The officer's face twisted, anger mixing with the thrill of control as he reached down, his hand closing over the front of Ray's shirt, pulling him up from the chair with a rough yank that made the cane clatter to the floor, the cap sliding off the table to land on the ground, rolling under the table's edge. Ray's feet shuffled, trying to keep balance, the pain in his knee sharp and hot as he was pressed against the wall beside the window, the officer's hand pressing into his chest. "Let's see some ID, old man," the officer said, his face close enough that Ray could see the small scar on his chin, the dark stubble growing there, the way his jaw clenched with the effort of holding back the excitement of the moment. "Maybe you're just another bum in a hat you found at a thrift store trying to get free coffee." Ray's hands came up, not in defense, but in an attempt to steady himself against the pressure, the edge of the table biting into his hip as he was pressed harder against the wall, the window rattling slightly in its frame. The officer's other hand came up, gripping Ray by the throat, the fingers pressing into the soft skin there, the pressure sharp, cutting off the air with frightening speed. Around them, the diner seemed to freeze. Rose's hand at her mouth, her eyes wide with fear, a man at the counter half rising before sinking back down, shaking his head, the fear stronger than the impulse to act. The young couple in the corner booth huddled together, the girl turning her face into the boy's shoulder, his eyes darting around, looking for help that did not come. Ray's breath came in ragged gasps, the edges of his vision darkening as the officer's grip tightened, the world narrowing to the pain in his throat, the cold hardness of the window at his back, the dull roar in his ears that sounded too much like the artillery he remembered from nights in Korea, the flash of flares in the darkness, the cries of men he could not save. The pain in his knee flared, buckling slightly, but the officer's grip held him upright, pinning him there like a trophy, like a warning to anyone watching. The cap lay on the floor, the brim crushed, the letters "What Vet" visible from where it had fallen, a silent witness to the humiliation unfolding in the quiet diner, the pride of a man who had given everything for a country that now watched in silence as he was torn down by a boy in a badge who knew nothing of sacrifice. Ray's eyes found the cap, focusing on it, the letters blurring in his vision as tears he refused to shed burned at the corners of his eyes. His hands came up again, this time to the officer's wrist, trying to pull it away, but his strength was gone. The years and the pain stealing the power from his arms, leaving him with nothing but the slow, burning shame of being powerless in front of people who would not help. The officer's face twisted into a grin as he leaned in closer, his voice a hiss meant for Ray alone, but loud enough for the silence of the diner to catch every word. "What's the matter, old man? Thought you were a hero. Thought you were tough." His fingers squeezed tighter, the world dimming around the edges, the sounds fading to a dull throb, the room shrinking to the face of the boy in front of him, and the cold, hard truth that no one was coming to help. In that moment, with the world closing in, with the air burning in his lungs and the past pressing heavy on his shoulders, Ray held on to one thought, one memory, one truth that kept him upright even as his body failed him. He had survived worse. He had endured hell and come back, and he would not give this boy the satisfaction of fear, would not give him the victory of seeing him broken. And so he stared back, blue eyes bright with the fire that still lived within him, even as the darkness crept closer, his breath a harsh rasp in the quiet, his hands gripping the wrist at his throat with all the strength he had left, refusing to let go, refusing to surrender as the diner around them held its breath, waiting, silent, complicit in the humiliation of a man who had given everything and who now stood alone against the cruel laughter of youth in uniform. The world had begun to slip away from Ray in layers of blurred light and the burn of memory as the young officer's grip continued to press against his throat, cutting off the thin thread of air that kept him tethered to the present. He could see the boy's lips moving, twisted into a sneer, but the words were muffled, lost beneath the roar of his pulse and the fragments of artillery shells exploding in the jungles of Korea, the shouting of medics, the stench of smoke and iron that flooded back with a violence that was almost comforting in its familiarity. His legs had begun to tremble, the pain in his knee a sharp, angry reminder of the wound that had never fully healed, the years that had layered over it like thin coats of paint on a rusted surface, never truly concealing the damage beneath. The cap lay on the floor beside the table, its brim bent, the letters that marked him as a veteran staring up at him like an accusation. Around him, the diner had frozen into a tableau of silent fear. Rose stood by the coffee pot, one hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide, unable to look away, but unable to move. The young couple in the corner booth huddled together, the girl's face pressed into the young man's shoulder as he glanced around, hoping for someone to intervene, but unwilling to rise himself. The man at the counter shifted uneasily, glancing at the floor, at his cup, at the door, anywhere but at the scene unfolding before him, the sound of the officer's breathing loud in the silence. Ray's hands had slackened on the officer's wrist, his strength fading, the darkness at the edge of his vision creeping inward with the slow certainty of nightfall. He could feel the moment coming, the moment when his knees would buckle, when the last of the air would leave his lungs, when the world would tilt and fall away from him entirely. And as the shadows grew deeper, he found himself thinking of the mornings when he had held his infant son in the crook of his arm, the tiny weight of him, the softness of his breath, the promise of a future that seemed bright and clean in those quiet dawn hours. He thought of that boy, the one he had named Carlos Ray Norris, who had grown into a man with a spirit like fire, who had left home with a uniform of his own, who had become something the world recognized, even if it had forgotten the father who had watched him take his first steps. The bell above the diner door jingled, a sharp, ordinary sound that cut through the heavy silence like a blade. The door swung open, letting in a gust of warm air and a slice of bright morning sunlight that fell across the floor, illuminating the cap where it lay, casting long shadows that trembled with the movement of the door. The young officer's head turned, his eyes narrowing in irritation at the interruption, but his hand did not loosen on Ray's throat. The man who stepped through the door was broad-shouldered, wearing jeans and a pale blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, forearms tanned and lined with muscle earned through decades of discipline rather than vanity. His hair was shorter now than it had been in the old movie posters, touched with streaks of silver at the temples, and his face was lined in the way of men who have spent their lives in the sun. But his eyes were sharp and blue, scanning the room in a single, measured sweep that missed nothing. He carried himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who had faced storms and come out the other side. And, as he took in the scene before him, there was a brief tightening around his mouth, a flicker of something cold and hard in his eyes. Chuck Norris paused just inside the door, letting it swing closed behind him with a soft thud, the bell giving one last jingle before silence fell again. His gaze moved from the frightened faces of the diners to the young officer with his hand around Ray's throat, to the older man pinned against the wall, his face pale, lips parted as he struggled for breath, the cap on the floor between them. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, caught between the seconds of the past and the promise of what was about to unfold. Chuck stepped forward, his boots silent on the old linoleum, his eyes locked on the officer, each step deliberate, controlled, the movement of a man who had never learned to rush because he had never needed to. The officer's eyes flicked back to Ray, confusion flickering there as he registered the way the room seemed to shift around this newcomer, the way the fear in the air had changed into something else, something closer to hope, edged with anticipation. "Let him go," Chuck said, his voice quiet, steady, carrying across the small space with the weight of a command that did not require volume to be heard. It was not a request, nor was it a threat. It was simply a statement of fact, spoken by a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and who had no interest in proving it unless he was given no choice. The officer blinked, his grip tightening reflexively on Ray's throat as he turned his full attention to Chuck, the sneer returning as he tried to reassert the dominance that had slipped from his grasp in the face of the calm authority before him. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, his voice louder now, false bravado ringing in the silence. But his feet shifted, a subtle step backward that betrayed the uncertainty he could not keep from his body, even as his mouth continued to move. Chuck took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the officer's face, his expression unchanged. "I said, let him go," he repeated, and this time there was a note in his voice, a cold edge. of steel that made the air in the room tighten, that made the young man's shoulders flinch before he could stop himself. For a moment, it seemed the officer might comply, his fingers loosening slightly on Ray's throat, but then the anger rose again, burning away the caution, the need to prove himself rekindling in the heat of being challenged. He turned fully toward Chuck, dragging Ray with him, using the older man's body as a shield, his other hand dropping to the baton at his belt, fingers closing around it, pulling it free with a sharp, metallic sound that made Rose gasp from behind the counter. Chuck's eyes dropped to the baton, then lifted back to the officer's face, and he stopped moving, his hands at his sides, relaxed, open. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering, and then he took one more step, closing the distance between them to just beyond the reach of the baton, his gaze steady, unblinking. "Last chance," Chuck said, and there was nothing in his voice now but calm certainty, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering himself so that he would never have to master others unless forced. The officer's face twisted, a snarl forming as he lifted the baton, bringing it back to swing, his grip on Ray loosening as he prepared to strike. In that fraction of a second, the diner seemed to move in slow motion, the faces of the onlookers reflecting fear, hope, disbelief. The young man in the corner tightened his hold on the girl beside him. Rose stepped back, her hand still at her mouth. The man at the counter stood halfway, torn between flight and the instinct to help. The baton never completed its arc. Chuck moved, his hand coming up with the precision of a striking snake, his fingers closing around the officer's wrist, stopping the swing mid-motion with a force that was absolute and undeniable. His other hand came up, gripping the officer's forearm, twisting just enough to send the baton clattering to the floor, spinning across the linoleum to come to rest against the wall. The officer gasped, his hand opening in reflex as the pain shot up his arm, and Chuck stepped closer, his body moving with effortless control as he positioned himself between Ray and the officer, his hands guiding the young man's arms away, forcing him to step back, away from Ray, away from the wall, into the open space of the diner. Ray slid down the wall, his knees given out as the support was removed, but a hand caught him, strong and steady, guiding him to sit gently against the wall, the pressure on his throat gone, the air rushing back into his lungs with a burning sweetness that made his eyes water. He looked up, blinking through the tears, and saw his son standing there, his back straight, his head high, his presence filling the room with a calm power that needed no explanation. The officer staggered backward, his hand rubbing at his wrist, his eyes wide now, the sneer gone, replaced by something closer to fear, though he tried to hide it behind anger. He opened his mouth, but no words came, his gaze flicking around the room, seeing the eyes watching him, the phones that had appeared in hands recording, capturing every moment, the proof of what was happening. Chuck turned to face him fully, his own hands lowering to his sides again, relaxed, open, but there was nothing relaxed in the way he stood, nothing uncertain in the way he watched the young man, measuring him, waiting, ready. The officer swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly, and took another step back, his foot bumping against the baton on the floor, the sound loud in the silence. Chuck did not move to pick up the baton, did not move at all, simply watched, the silence stretching out, heavy with the weight of choice. The officer's chest heaved as he breathed, his eyes darting to the door, to the windows, to the people watching, to the man who stood before him, calm and immovable. In that silence, Ray lifted his hand, fingers trembling as they reached for the cap lying on the floor beside him, dragging it into his lap, his eyes closing briefly as his fingers smoothed the brim, his breath coming in slow, painful draws, but steady, alive. When he opened his eyes, they were clear, the blue sharp again as they lifted to meet his son's gaze, a silent message passing between them. Gratitude, pride, relief. Chuck's eyes softened for the briefest moment as he looked at his father. Then he turned back to the officer, his expression hardening again, the calm returning like a tide. "It's over," he said, his voice low, carrying across the room, and in that moment there was no question of truth in those words, no question of what would happen next. The officer's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as the reality settled in, the weight of the moment pressing down until he could not bear it. He turned, shoving past the tables, moving toward the door with quick, jerky steps, his face flushed, his breath coming in angry gasps. The bell jingled again as he pushed through, the door swinging closed behind him, the light shifting, the air moving, and then he was gone, the sound of his boots fading into the street outside. The diner remained silent for a long moment after he left, the air thick with the aftermath of fear and the fragile, trembling relief that followed. Then, slowly, the world began to move again. The man at the counter sitting down fully, the young couple in the corner exhaling in unison, Rose stepping forward, her hands reaching out toward Ray. But it was Chuck who moved first, bending down to help his father to his feet, his hands strong and careful, lifting him with the ease of a man who had spent a lifetime in discipline, who had learned the true weight of those he cared for. Ray stood, leaning on his son for a moment, his hand tightening on Chuck's arm, the cap clutched to his chest, his breath coming easier now, the color returning to his face. Together they stood in the small diner, the world outside moving on, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the street alive with the sounds of a day that did not know what had just happened inside those walls. And for a moment, in that quiet space, there was nothing but the two of them, father and son, the past and the present, meeting in the soft light of the morning, the promise of what would come next waiting in the steady beat of their hearts. The sunlight had shifted higher by the time Chuck guided his father back to the booth by the window, the seat Ray had chosen each morning for years. The diner felt different now, as if the air had cleared after a storm, leaving the silence ringing with the echoes of what had just taken place. Rose hurried over, her hands fluttering for a moment before she settled them on the edge of the table. Her eyes shining with tears, she tried to blink away as she looked between father and son. She set down 2 fresh cups of coffee without asking, her lips moving in a silent prayer before she turned away, leaving them alone for a moment in the warmth of the morning. Ray adjusted himself in the booth, letting out a slow breath that trembled on the exhale. He placed his cap gently on the table, smoothing the brim with a careful hand, the letters facing him, grounding him in the moment. Chuck slid into the seat across from him, his eyes never leaving his father's face, the quiet between them alive with words neither needed to speak. Outside, the street continued with its life, cars moving in slow waves past the window, children on bicycles riding by in pairs, their laughter carrying through the glass. In the corner of the diner, the young couple who had witnessed everything sat with their heads together, the girl's hands wrapped around her cup while the young man scrolled on his phone, his thumb moving quickly, pausing, tapping, scrolling again. Across the diner, the man who had been at the counter was now holding his phone in front of him, the screen bright, his face lit by the glow as he watched the video he had captured, the shaky footage showing the moment Chuck had stepped between Ray and the officer, the calm authority in his movements unmistakable even through the grainy lens. It was not long before the notifications began. Phones buzzed on the tables, lighting up screens with new messages, shared posts, the video leaping from one device to another with the unstoppable momentum of something real, something raw that people felt in their bones. Chuck watched it happen without surprise, his face calm, resigned, knowing that once something like this took flight, it would not be stopped. Ray's phone buzzed in his pocket, the old flip phone vibrating against his hip, startling him for a moment as he pulled it free, flipping it open with a practiced motion that seemed at odds with the technology's age. The screen lit up with a series of missed calls and messages, names of neighbors, old friends, numbers he did not recognize. He frowned, confused, glancing up at Chuck with a question in his eyes. "It's out there now," Chuck said quietly, nodding toward the people in the diner, toward the world beyond the glass. They saw what happened. Ray closed the phone, placing it on the table beside his cap, his hand resting on it for a moment, the lines of his face deepening as he looked down, thinking of the years he had spent living quietly, hoping for nothing more than to be left in peace with the memories that were his alone to carry. He had never asked for recognition, had never wanted the eyes of strangers to turn toward him with pity or praise. The wars he had fought were his, the friends he had lost, the pain he endured each morning as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. All of it was a part of him, but it was not something he had ever believed the world would see or understand. The door of the diner opened again, the bell chiming brightly, and a young woman entered, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, a camera bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the room with the sharpness of someone used to looking for a story. Behind her, a man followed with a camera already raised, the lens focused, the red light blinking. They paused just inside, conferring in low voices before approaching the booth where Chuck and Ray sat, the camera shifting to capture their faces. "Mr. Norris," the woman began, her voice careful, respectful, but tinged with the urgency of her profession, "we saw the video. We're from the local news, and we'd like to get your statement about what happened here this morning." Ray looked up sharply, his mouth opening as if to protest, but Chuck lifted a hand, his calm gaze settling on the young woman. "There's no statement," he said, his voice even, his tone leaving no room for debate. "There's nothing to add." The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking between them, the camera lens capturing every detail, the quiet dignity in Ray's posture, the unshakable steadiness in Chuck's eyes. "Sir, people are talking about this already. It's gone viral. There are calls for accountability, for recognition of your father's service, for—" "This isn't about us," Chuck interrupted, his voice softening as he glanced at his father, who sat quietly, his hand now resting on the cap as if it were the only anchor he had left in a world that had suddenly become too loud. "It's about what's right and about the way we should treat each other. That's all." The woman swallowed, nodding, but the camera stayed fixed on them, capturing the moment before they turned and left, the bell jingling again as the door closed behind them, leaving the diner in a silence that was different this time, filled with the weight of what had begun. The video spread beyond the town by midday, shared across social media, picked up by larger news outlets, discussed on morning shows, the image of Chuck standing calmly between the young officer and the old man pinned to the wall becoming a symbol of something people could not fully define but felt deeply. Comments flooded in. Thousands, then tens of thousands. People sharing stories of their fathers, their grandfathers, their own experiences with veterans, with injustice, with the quiet dignity that so often went unnoticed until moments like this forced the world to see. Calls came into the diner, to Ray's phone, to Chuck's representatives, requests for interviews, for statements, for appearances. Chuck refused them all. His message, always the same, delivered with a patience that came from years of discipline. This is not about us. It's about respect. It's about how we treat those who have given their lives, their youth, their strength for the rest of us to live the lives we do. It's about remembering. Ray found himself walking down the street with people stopping him, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service in a way that made his eyes sting with emotions he had kept buried for decades. Children waved at him as he passed, parents explaining who he was, what he had done, why it mattered. Veterans came to find him, men and women in wheelchairs with canes, with service caps of their own, sharing quiet nods, stories in parking lots, moments of connection that needed no words. At night, Ray sat in his small apartment, the quiet pressing around him, his cap resting on the table, the phone lighting up again and again with messages of thanks, of support, of people telling him that they saw him now, that they respected what he had done, what he had given. He read each message, his fingers trembling as they moved across the buttons, saving some, deleting others, unable to process the flood of attention that had come so suddenly into the life he had lived quietly for so long. Chuck spent his days trying to shield his father from the worst of it, from the reporters who lingered outside the diner, from the curiosity that came with the sudden fame. He answered what questions he could, always redirecting the conversation to the importance of community, of taking care of one another, of the need for respect and dignity, the lessons his father had taught him by example long before the world had decided to pay attention. The officer who had attacked Ray was suspended pending investigation, the department releasing statements about accountability, promising to review procedures, to examine the conduct of their officers, the public pressure forcing action that should have been taken without it. The officer himself made no statements, his silence speaking volumes, the image of him standing with his baton, his hand around the throat of an 85-year-old veteran, now a permanent part of the public record. Veterans groups reached out, offering support to Ray, inviting him to gatherings, to speak, to share his experiences. His story now seen as something that could inspire others, remind them of the sacrifices made by so many who came before. Ray declined most of the invitations, but he attended a few, standing quietly in rooms filled with men and women who understood what it meant to carry memories that could never be put down, who saw in him a reflection of themselves. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange over the small town, Chuck and Ray walked together down the main street, the shadows stretching long before them. Children played on the sidewalks, their laughter ringing through the air, and people nodded as they passed, tipping hats, offering smiles. Ray walked with his cane, his steps careful but steady, his back straighter than it had been in years, the cap on his head sitting proudly, the letters WWW Vet visible to all who cared to look. Chuck walked beside him, matching his pace, his eyes scanning the street, but softening as he glanced at his father, seeing in him the strength that had shaped his own life, the quiet courage that had been his guide even when he was too young to understand it fully. They paused outside the diner, looking through the window at the booth where Ray had sat that morning, where everything had changed, where nothing had really changed at all, because the truth of who they were, of what mattered, had always been there, waiting to be seen. Ray turned to Chuck, his eyes bright in the fading light, the lines of his face deepening with a smile that was small but real. "They see it now," he said softly, his voice rough but steady, the words carrying the weight of years lived and battles fought both on distant fields and in the quiet of everyday life. Chuck nodded, placing a hand on his father's shoulder, squeezing gently, grounding them both in that moment. "They do," he agreed, his own voice quiet, filled with the understanding that came from a lifetime of watching, of learning, of becoming the man his father had hoped he would be. They stood there for a long moment, the world moving around them, the sounds of the town washing over them like a tide, the laughter, the music from a passing car, the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. It was a moment of peace, a moment of connection, a moment that they both understood would remain with them, carried in their hearts, a reminder of what it meant to stand for something, to protect what mattered, to honor the past while building the future. And as they turned to continue their walk home, the lights of the town beginning to glow softly around them, they did so with the knowledge that dignity, once reclaimed, was not easily lost, that respect, once earned, could inspire others to find their courage, and that sometimes it only took one quiet, steady moment to remind the world of what it had almost forgotten. Morning came softly over the small Texas town, spilling gold across rooftops and warming the sidewalks still cool from the night. The street outside the diner was quiet except for the hum of an old truck rolling past, its headlights flicking off as dawn settled fully, birds perched on wires above singing into the brightening sky. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the town had exhaled after the storm of attention, the whirlwind of cameras and voices that had spun around the old man and his son. The diner stood there, unchanged in its details, the green paint peeling, the door's bell ready to sing as customers entered, but something was different in the way people looked at it, as if it now held a memory they all shared. Inside, the smell of coffee and warm bread filled the air, the radio whispering a country tune, and the clatter of plates made a comforting backdrop as Rose moved between tables, her eyes scanning the door every few moments. She paused, catching her reflection in the glass of the coffee pot, brushing a stray hair back from her forehead before turning quickly as the bell over the door chimed, announcing the arrival she had been expecting. Ray stepped carefully inside, his cane tapping softly against the worn linoleum, the morning light catching on the silver in his hair, his cap placed firmly on his head, the letters Wowit Vet clear for all to see. His back was straight, his shoulders set, his eyes sharp as he took in the familiar space, the faces that turned toward him with smiles that held respect now, not pity. Behind him, Chuck entered, moving with the quiet confidence that had always surrounded him, the kind that made people straighten without realizing, that made them feel safe without fully knowing why. He held the door a moment longer, allowing a young mother with her child to enter, tipping his head with a soft greeting before stepping aside, letting the door close gently behind him. They moved toward their usual table by the window, the table that had seen the worst of a moment and had survived, the place where a man had nearly been broken but had found himself lifted by the simple act of another standing for him. Rose was already there, setting down 2 cups of coffee, the steam rising in thin ribbons, her eyes glistening as she met Ray's gaze, squeezing his hand briefly before stepping back to give them space. Ray lowered himself into the booth, adjusting his position carefully, the pain in his knee a constant companion, but one he had learned to live with, to accept as the price of all the days he had been given since those faraway battles. He removed his cap, setting it on the table with deliberate care, turning it so the words faced the window, a reminder to himself and to the world outside of who he was and who he had always been. Chuck sat across from him, his hands wrapping around the warm cup, his eyes on his father, the quiet between them a conversation in itself. They drank their coffee slowly, the world outside waking up as they watched. People moving along the sidewalk, some pausing to look in, to lift a hand in greeting, to nod with a smile that said they understood now, that they saw. A young father passed with his little boy, the child's eyes catching on the cap in the window, pulling at his father's hand, pointing with the bright curiosity only children possess. The father paused, bending to listen, nodding before glancing into the diner, meeting Ray's eyes with a quiet gratitude, mouthing the words, "Thank you," before continuing on, the boy still looking back over his shoulder as they walked away. Ray watched them go, his hand lifting slightly in a small wave, his chest tightening with an emotion that was both pride and a tender ache for the years gone by, for the friends who could not be here to see this, for the moments that had been carried in silence for so long. Chuck reached across the table, placing his hand over his father's for a moment, a grounding gesture, a reminder that some burdens were lighter when shared, that some honors were worth carrying for those who could not. The door opened again, and a man in his 40s stepped in, his suit jacket neat, a briefcase in hand, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Ray and Chuck. He approached with a careful respect, pausing at the edge of their table, his hand extending as he introduced himself as a representative from the local Veterans Association. He spoke softly, explaining that they were organizing an event, a gathering to honor the veterans in their community, to share their stories, to remind the younger generations of the sacrifices made by those who had come before. He asked if Ray would attend, if he would consider saying a few words, if he would allow them to thank him in a way that went beyond quiet nods and whispered gratitude. Ray looked down at his hands, the lines in them deep, the veins raised, the skin thin but still strong. For a moment, he saw himself as he had been, young and scared, pushing forward through mud and rain, through fear that clung like a shadow, refusing to let it break him because there had been no other choice, because others had depended on him to stand when it mattered. He looked up at the man, then at Chuck, seeing the encouragement in his son's eyes, the pride that was quiet but unmistakable. He nodded, his voice low as he agreed, surprising even himself with the steadiness of it, the acceptance that perhaps it was time to share what had been carried alone for too long. The man thanked him, shaking his hand firmly before stepping back, promising to send details to make sure transportation was arranged, to ensure that Ray would be comfortable and cared for, his respect clear in every word. As he left, the door closing behind him, Chuck and Ray sat in the quiet that followed, the promise of the future resting between them, the knowledge that some stories needed to be told not for glory, but so others would remember, so they would understand. Days passed, each one bringing a quiet anticipation, as the town prepared for the event. Flyers appeared in shop windows, in the post office, on the notice board at the grocery store, announcing an evening to honor veterans, to share stories of service and sacrifice, to remind the community of the men and women who had stood for them, who had carried the weight of freedom on their shoulders. Children came to the diner with their parents, pointing at Ray, asking questions, their parents answering carefully, explaining who he was, what he had done, why it mattered. Ray found himself answering questions he had never thought he would, telling stories in small pieces, moments of humor, of fear, of hope, of loss, each word bringing a memory into the light, each story reminding him of the faces of the men he had served with, of the promises made in the dark, of the laughter shared in the brief moments of peace. Chuck watched him with quiet pride, stepping in when the stories grew heavy, guiding the conversations with the skill of someone who had spent his life understanding the balance between strength and vulnerability. The evening of the event arrived, the town hall filled with people, chairs arranged in neat rows, the air buzzing with conversations, with the laughter of children, with the respectful quiet of those who understood the significance of the gathering. Ray sat at the front, his cap in his hands, his cane resting beside him. Chuck standing quietly at his side, a steady presence, a reminder that he was not alone, that he was seen, that he was honored. As the speeches began, as the names of veterans were read aloud, as families stood to share their gratitude, their stories, their love, Ray felt the weight of the years settle around him, not as a burden, but as a testament to a life lived with dignity, with courage, with the quiet strength that came from knowing he had done what needed to be done, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. When his name was called, when he stood with the help of Chuck's hand on his arm, the applause that rose around him was a soft wave, a sound that washed over him, filling him with a warmth that brought tears to his eyes. Tears he did not wipe away, letting them fall, letting himself feel the gratitude, the respect, the honor that he had never asked for but had always deserved. He spoke briefly, his voice steady, sharing a story of a friend who had not come home, of a promise made beside a fire under a dark sky filled with distant sounds of conflict, of a promise to live well, to live fully, to remember those who could not. He spoke of dignity, of the importance of standing when others could not, of the strength found in compassion, in respect, in honoring each other not just in words, but in actions. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment, a silence that was heavy with understanding, before the applause rose again, stronger this time, filled with the voices of a community that had come to see, to listen, to remember. That night, as they walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, the air cool around them, the stars bright above, Ray and Chuck moved together in a quiet that was comfortable, the rhythm of their steps steady on the pavement. They paused outside the diner, looking in through the darkened windows, seeing their reflections there, side by side, the past and the present meeting in the glass. Ray lifted his cap, adjusting it on his head, turning to look at Chuck with a small smile that spoke of pride, of love, of a gratitude that needed no words. Chuck placed his hand on his father's shoulder, squeezing gently, grounding them both in that moment, the promise of tomorrow resting in the shared strength between them. They turned together, continuing their walk down the quiet street, the sounds of the town soft around them, the laughter of children, the hum of distant voices, the world moving forward as it always did. But now it moved with the memory of what had been shared, with the reminder that dignity and honor, once seen, could not be forgotten, that respect, once given, could inspire others to find their own courage, to stand when it mattered, to carry forward the legacy of those who had shown them the way. And in that quiet, under the watchful glow of the streetlights, with the stars bright above them and the world stretching out before them, they walked on, father and son, side by side, the promise of all they had lived and all they had yet to live, guiding each step, reminding them both that true strength was found not in the loud moments, but in the quiet choices, in the steady presence, in the unshakable commitment to live with dignity, to honor the past, and to shape the future with compassion, courage, and love. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. check out the other stories on our channel that will inspire and challenge you, and if you know someone who needs to see this, share this video with them today.